Alkışlarınızla Timothy Ash, sahnede.
In this disastrous intervention in Iran is creating huge systemic risks for the global economy. This war is just another nail in the coffin of NATO, right? NATO is dead. We just need to be honest about it. Trump's a bully, you confront him and he backs off. The Europeans are idiots, frankly. Turkey can provide Ukraine with the scale to scale up its drones to beat the Russians. Europe can't. I'm Tim Ash, those who don't know me. It's great to see so many people here. Lovely you wasted your Saturday afternoon coming to see me here. Great, thank you for the organisers. It's my pleasure to be here. I love being in Turkey. I come as often as I can. My wife's here as well, and we love Turkey, which is one of the reasons we're kind of here. Maybe I thought I'd start a little bit. We all have biases. And I think it's important to know my biases. I mean, I'm here to talk to you about geopolitics and markets, right? But, I have my own biases. And for you to understand and understand where I'm coming, you need to understand them. So guess, who am I? What do I do? What's my role, my job? And so when I think about geopolitics and markets, where do I come from, right? So some of you know I've worked as a professional economist for kind of 40 years. I have two roles at the moment. One, I work for RBC Blue Bay Asset Management. It's a large international Canadian-owned asset manager. We manage about $500 billion of money, mostly in fixed income, so government bonds, but we also do rates and FX. And my job is to advise a team of about 300 portfolio managers where to invest, particularly in emerging markets and between emerging markets. So it's basically, do I buy Turkey or Egypt or Ukraine or Brazil? And then within countries, so for example, we may be invested in Turkey. Should we increase our exposure to Turkey or reduce our exposure to Turkey? And in Turkey, what are the kind of best assets in fixed income space to invest in, right? So that's one job, and I've done that for 10 years, and I've worked in that kind of role for 30 years. I was 20 years working for different international banks. I always say I've worked for everyone apart from the Russians. So I've worked for Nomura, Japanese, ICBC Standard, South Africa, Chinese Bank, Royal Bank of Scotland, not Scottish, British. Obviously, I've worked for the Americans, Bear Stearns, ABN AMRO, West LB, so German banks as well. My other role is I'm an associate fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, in various capacities. I spent most of my career looking at Russia and Ukraine. I mean, I guess I'm a specialist on this region, particularly, emerging Europe. But I've lived in Ukraine, lived in Russia. So that, I'm a fellow, and I'm seen to be an expert on that. The two roles work quite well together. Because a lot of the stuff I do for Chatham House also has impacts on how I view countries. And people often ask me, how do you look at a country like Turkey? Right, actually, before I go there, I started off in Soviet studies in the 1980s. That was my specialism. I traveled around the Soviet Union. I was a postgraduate fellow at Exeter University and Heriot-Watt, looking at the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed halfway through my research, and then I moved to do transition. I always avoided doing Turkey. Right? People asked me, please, can you cover Turkey? It seemed too complicated, too difficult. And I was at one particular institution, and someone left, and I had to do Turkey. So I've spent the last 25 years doing Turkey, and it's been one of the most interesting, and it has everything. It has interesting history, culture, politics, geopolitics. The economic story is mega interesting. But people often ask me, how do you understand Turkey, right? And I have no Turkish heritage. My wife is Pakistani Bengali. She's not Turkish, which adds, I think, to the perspective, because I think it helps to understand, the kind of cultural aspects around Turkey. But how do you understand Turkey? And I think and what I bring to the table that is perhaps a bit different to other analysts is I don't give a Turkish perspective. I'm not a Turk, and I try and help foreigners understand what's going on in Turkey, because I try and give a different, fresh perspective. And I try and give a holistic perspective. So I visit a lot, I meet as many people as I can, I meet government officials, I meet opposition officials, I meet diplomats, bankers, journalists, and it's to trying to understand the whole story, what is going on, right? And again, I have my biases, I come to this country with biases, but in the end, what I'm trying to understand is the investment story here, how the Turkey story relates to the team I work with at RBC Blue Bay and how we view Turkey's direction of travel and risk reward from an investment perspective. So kind of that's where I come from. So I thought that was probably quite important for a few minutes to show who I am, where I come from, what my biases are. And then I wanted to talk geopolitics and markets. I guess maybe 4 things, depends how much time we have to look at. First thing is, we have this war in Iran, Gulf War III. And what is interesting from a markets perspective is that markets they seem quite sanguine. We have this huge war with huge ramifications. If you look at Fatih Birol, the director of the IEA, this is the biggest energy and oil price shock we've had since the 1970s, perhaps even bigger. You look at the supply chain implications. I guess the big difference for me in terms of Gulf states from the 1970s is we've seen these diversification strategies. Vision 2030, everyone has a vision. They've moved away from oil to other stuff. The Gulf region now is so important to so many supply chains. Dubai, huge transport infrastructure hub, going down, going up the value-added chain in terms of energy. They refine products into other stuff, right? Logistics, transport. So many of our global supply chains come through the straits, right? And what's clear is that if you look at the analysts who cover the region, even in a best case scenario, which is probably not my base case, even in the best case scenario where we have Iran, US, Israel deal very soon, the Straits is not going to go back to two-way traffic for at least 6 months, right? At least. So we're facing this global shock that will have big ramifications, I would think, for lots of things that we use in our daily lives, helium, or you name it. And there will be a growth and inflation shock, and yet the S&P is at historical highs. If you look at credit spreads, they've widened a bit, or you look at government bond yields, they've increased a bit, but not much. If you look at Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the cost of borrowing money by these countries, it's more or less where it was before the full-scale invasion, right? How is that kind of possible? And some colleagues of mine were in Washington at the IMF meetings a couple of weeks ago, actually last week, and they came back, they met lots of policymakers, so they met lots of central bankers and finance ministers, and the message from that crew was, why is the market so sanguine, right? How come equity markets or credit markets are not trading the increased risks that we think are there? The Deputy Governor of the Bank of England yesterday said something exactly that. Why aren't equity markets much weaker than they are? We are concerned, we think they're going to go weaker. So in trying to explain why markets are where they are, I probably explain a number of reasons. One, I think TACO, Trump always chickens out. The market's been conditioned by the liberation tariffs we saw last year, that in the end, Trump will roll over and do a deal, right? As soon as the market reaches some critical point, there will be a turning point, and that's a buying opportunity. And the experience last year is if you went against that, you lost money, right? So the market is waiting for Trump to chicken out. The other factor, I think, is that we live in a hugely complicated geopolitical world, but I think in the last 15 or 20 years, what's extraordinary is black swan events happen. They're the base case. They're the white swans. Things that you could never imagine would have happened. Global financial crisis, European sovereign debt crisis, COVID, war in Ukraine. Now just imagine we have the worst case. We have a war in Iran with Israel and the US bombing Iran. Extraordinary. I think it was a very low probability for most people, right? And I'd say that if you look at those events, the market DNA, the institutional memory of the market is that all those events, which were systemic events, systemically could have been hugely damaging to the global economy, didn't really bring the global economy down. We managed through them, we survived, and in the end, people made money out of them all, ultimately. I mean, people lost money initially, but then lots of different solutions were implied, liquidity, rates were cut, liquidity, but in the end, people made money. And that's the memory that, in a way, people feel that risk events, we can survive, and you don't want to be the wrong side of it. So again, that's the way the market's positioned. A couple of other positives, I'd say, is one, the US economy is looking strong still. It was strong under Biden. We've seen some deregulatory cuts. We've seen some tax cuts. I mean, earnings are strong, growth strong generally. The perception, obviously, is that the war in Iran will hurt Europe and the rest of the world more than the US. So again, I guess that's holding the S&P up. In terms of emerging markets, what was striking for me was in those periods of systemic risk, when we saw central banks respond by providing more liquidity to markets, and we call beta top-down. The top-down story was positive and risk positive. When you wanted to buy risk assets, in emerging markets, for example, often it was very difficult to find the good emerging market story. If I think 5 years ago, Turkey had an orthodox policy, devaluation, inflation, Argentina, South Africa with the Zuma period, Venezuela. I mean, you looked across the spectrum of EM countries, there were no really good emerging market stories. I think now, actually, going into this crisis, the positive and the underpinning is that you have Turkey's turnaround, orthodox policy, decent team, numbers looking a lot better. Argentina, South Africa, governance of national unity. Pakistan, Egypt, faced default, went on a reform path with the IMF, and lots of other countries that were in difficulty 3 or 4 years ago chose a debt restructuring path. Sri Lanka's, Ecuador's, Suriname's, Ukraine, Ghana, Zambia. They've gone to restructuring, they've gone through the restructuring, and now there's actually not many countries at point of debt distress. So the EM universe is looking a lot stronger. We had that period before the Iran war where dollar was weak. It meant EM currencies were strong. It meant that inflation was low because EM currencies were strong. It allowed central banks to be in a position to cut rates. And actually, post-COVID, EM central banks were at the front of the curve in terms of policy tightening, which means, again, as we face this risk factor from Iran, emerging market currencies and central banks in a relatively strong position. So that's the positives, right? And why, maybe there's some logic why markets are relatively sanguine on the Iran risk. I don't really buy it, but that's the logic. I think what concerns me is that in a Trump world, multilateral institutions have been eroded, right? If you think of the reaction to the global financial crisis, we had joined up thinking, US, China working together, we had G7, we had G20, the IMF. These institutions were strong. Now they have hardly any, we're not working together. So when faced by this potentially hugely systemic shock from the war in Iran and supply chain disruptions, I'm not sure we're going to see the US and China working together to help the global economy out. I mean, the other angle, I guess, is in Europe also, our fiscal space in Europe is very weak. UK, France, high public debt, large budget deficits. That space we had after the global financial crisis to loosen fiscal, to insulate our economies is kind of gone. I mean, Europe is a mixed space. I mean, Germany has more fiscal space, the Scandies, but certainly old Europe, France, UK, bit of a difficulty. And I think the other concern perhaps is this idea that the Americans think they're insulated from what goes on in Iran. I kind of don't think so. I mean, I think if it's likely we see those disruptions to, say, jet fuel prices. I mean, most European airlines are now reducing the number of flights, they're laying off ground staff. I mean, US airlines will face the same challenge, right? The costs of airline travel will change, the whole lodging, travel stuff will also impact on the US. And I thought what was quite interesting in the last week, a focus, if you remember, there was this story about UAE asking for dollar swaps from the US Treasury, right? Now, my initial thought was, what is going on? UAE has a balance sheet, it's a sovereign, it has sovereign wealth fund wealth of a couple of $1 trillion. I mean, if UAE is short of dollars, we have a serious systemic problem, right? So what is this telling us? And actually, there's, I mean, the read from it ultimately was actually this was not a UAE problem. The Americans were concerned because clearly UAE is vulnerable because of disruptions to business and exports. There will be, it will have, weaker fiscal position, weaker balance of payments position. It will need to sell some assets. And I think the Americans were worried actually that this could destabilize US Treasury markets. The UAE guys and the Gulf guys will be forced to sell US Treasuries to fund their increased needs domestically, right? And it was actually more, the message basically is it just shows that often in these systemic hits, you don't quite know where the skeletons are hidden. I mean, I was at Bear Stearns, big US bank, failed in the global financial crisis. I mean, that experience in 2008, 2007, 8 and 9 showed that when you have these huge systemic hits, you don't quite know what the full repercussions are, and again, where the skeletons are hitting. And I think that showed you that even the US, I don't think necessarily is going to be insulated in a worst case scenario from all this. So I think that probably explains markets and why I don't quite figure it out. I think the market should be a lot weaker. I think equity markets should definitely be a lot weaker. Risk, I think what we can look at now, the implications. My second thing I was going to look at is, what are my implications, my big readouts from the Iran Gulf War scenario, sort of bigger picture takes. And one obvious one is, and my base case is, I just don't see this resolved very easily. I think that if you look at Iran and the US in particular, the irony is Iran had a nuclear program as its deterrent. The big irony is that it didn't go nuclear. It was in this no man's land, not going to the point of nuclear, but the deterrent was them not going to nuclear. That nuclear program in the end failed. It got them attacked, right? The mistake they made was not going nuclear, right? And what we've seen in the last year or so is Iran looking for a new deterrent. And it's found the deterrent. And it's found the deterrent because, on its doorstep was this huge resource of Gulf states diversifying the economies and making them more important to the global economy, added with its ballistic and drone program that created a target-rich environment very close. I mean, I guess a lot of the focus in the last year or so, or a bit longer, post-October 7th, was that, Iran's threat to Israel. I mean, Israel is a very small target, a long way away, extremely well defended. For Iran, for the Gulf states, it's very hard to defend a huge space. And again, my Ukraine experience, if you look at the war in Ukraine, drones change global warfare. 20,000 drone can reap huge impact in terms of assets, energy sector assets and assets that have impact on the global economy, and very hard to defend against, right? And, again, Ukraine, we've seen this war of iteration in terms of 1 week, the Ukrainians have an advantage, the Russians have an advantage, but there is no kind of 100% defense against a drone, right? It's maybe a 95% defense, but the 5% ability to get through from Iran is all they need. All they need to keep the Gulf states insecure and vulnerable and the global economy concerned about security in that space, that's the deterrent, right? So Iran now has leverage. I don't see any defense from the Americans, any ability of the Gulf states or Americans to defend against that. It has leverage in negotiations. It's going to use that. And I guess its experience is, the Americans from the start made clear this is a war, it's an existential war for the Iranians. The Americans spelled it out. We want a regime change. So now the Iranians think, well, we will only negotiate a deal when we're sure of our defense. We're sure you accept our deterrent, and you're not going to mow the grass, continue to come in and attack us over a period of time. So I think the Iranians will negotiate very, very hard. For the Iranians, it's all about detail. We saw that in the JCPOA. And for Trump, it's not about detail. For Trump, it's about the easy win. His attention span is very light. We saw that again in the negotiations in Ukraine. I mean, partly the reason that, he said a deal could be done in 24 hours, a year later there's no deal, is Trump is not a details person. But details matter in these scenarios, absolutely matter, right? So I think, but clearly, I mean, Trump doesn't want to put boots on the ground, very unpopular domestically. He's got himself in this war he's struggling to get out of. Probably the base case is a weak ceasefire holds, but the straits remain subject to disruption. And again, I would argue that's very damaging to the global economy. So I guess that's my outlook for the Gulf. But what are the wider implications of all this? Well, Trump, this is a defeat. I think he went in to change the news cycle from the poll ratings pre-midterm, Epstein news. He changed the news, trying to change the news cycle. It failed. So, and his poll ratings are even worse. Gas prices are $4 a barrel. What does he do? The concern I have that he iterates somewhere else, looks for low-hanging fruit. Cuba is the obvious one. Obviously, I think Marco Rubio would have an interest there. Greenland, up for grabs, easy win. And I think the other one is going back to the peace in Ukraine, trying to force a bad peace on Ukraine and a cave-in to Russia. All possibilities. So we watch for that. That will create more geopolitical kind of tensions, etc. Second one is maybe look at the war in Ukraine in particular. I mean, Trump will try and force a deal on Ukraine. But actually, the war in Iran, lots of focus on the fact that that Russia has been a winner, right? Oil prices, if you look at the period before the war, Western sanctions were just beginning to work. The discount for Urals oil prices on WTI was about a third. The daily energy export receipts Russia was receiving in February, just before the war, had dropped from 1.2 billion a day euros around the time of the invasion to 450 million. Russia was really struggling, budget deficit, current account was moderating. They were in trouble. And then the war happened, and suddenly their energy export receipts have doubled. They're now flush. Putin will think he can continue the war for more time. So long war from Putin's perspective, he's given him a new breath of life. But actually, what's the interesting angle for me now is that at the same time, we've seen the Ukrainians also given a new lease of life almost. The fact that the Americans were not able to defend the Gulf states actually against drone and ballistic missile attacks is extraordinary. It's extraordinary because it suggests the Americans learnt nothing from the war in Ukraine. Ukraine is the cutting edge of drone and military technology warfare. The Americans have been supplying kit and technology. You'd have thought they have learnt from that and been able to defend against Iranian drones. What we've seen is exactly the opposite. The Iranians have extraordinary success in beating US and Gulf defenses, right? The attacks on US embassies, the early warning planes that were taken out at Prince Sultan Airport, quite extraordinary. But the Ukrainians have been able to use this as an opportunity to demonstrate their drone, technology advantages. We've seen all these strategic deals signed between Zelensky and the Saudis, every Gulf state. This will bring big revenue benefits to Ukraine, and it will also bring strategic benefits that the Gulf states will support Ukraine going forward more diplomatic. It's actually bred a new lease of life to the Ukrainians. At the same time, we're seeing them hold the battlefield, change the dynamics on the battlefield, and actually take the war to Russia. And the other interesting angle, I think, from the Ukrainian war perspective of all this, has been the Ukrainians have deep strike drone advantage on Russia, or capability. If you go back a year, 2 years, a lot of the focus was on US-supplied kit and NATO-supplied kit, Storm Shadow, HIMARS, ATACMS, and the Ukrainians wanted to hit deep into Russia, into Russian energy infrastructure. And the West basically said to them, please don't do that. You will impact on global markets. You will force oil prices higher. That's going to hurt us. Please don't do that. What changed was the Americans acted in their interest, which was attacking Iran and pushing energy prices higher. So the Ukrainians said, wait a minute. When you want to act in your interests and take Iran, global oil prices don't matter. And now you're telling us that we shouldn't be hitting the Russians. Actually, forget about that. And so the Ukrainians have been accelerating their attacks on Russian energy infrastructure in the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea with increasing effect. And they've hit something like 40 to 50% of Russian export capacity, and we'll see more of that. So actually, I see the Ukrainians increasingly confident. They think they've held the Russians, they have the military advantage, and they're willing to hold out against the Americans. And then this is the other interesting angle of the war. I think for me, and I would spell it out, and we need to spell it out, this war is just another nail in the coffin of NATO, right? NATO is dead. We just need to be honest about it. I know there's a NATO summit coming up in Ankara, but US actions under Trump have shown and demonstrated, and I come at this, I admit, from a European perspective, which may be different from a Turkish perspective, but I think US actions have shown that US under Trump and Europe no longer share the same interests and values, right? Interests. Number one European interest is defending against the existential threat from Russia to Ukraine and Europe. Number one threat, absolutely. And what has Trump done? He's pulled financial support for Ukraine. He's only sending missiles and equipment to Ukraine if it's paid for by the Europeans. And he starts a war in Iran that draws down on critical anti-ballistic missile defenses that could have been used in Ukraine. And his intervention increases oil prices and energy prices that hurts Europe, right? All these actions are not in Europe's interests. They're acting against Europe's interests. And I get it. I mean, Europe has different priorities, different interests. The number one argued national security threat to the US is China. I'd say for Europe, China is very low on the list of our threats. Russia is number one. I'd say a US under Trump and Elon Musk is probably quite high also in terms of threats to Europe. I mean, to have Elon Musk intervening domestic UK politics. Tony Robinson, I don't know if you know this character, but this far-right political leader in the US accepted in the State Department quite recently, or an official visit to Israel, supporting far-right and far-left political movements in Europe, I don't think is helpful for unity in Europe, right? So what we're seeing is the US acting its interests, which I totally get, but we have different interests, right? So, the attacks on Greenland. I mean, the pressure to take Greenland. I mean, this is a NATO ally member state, Greenland, quite extraordinary. And I just think the war in Iran just affirmed this idea that NATO is dead. Europe needs to accelerate its autonomous defense capability. What does that mean? And going back to Ukraine, again, there's been a lot of focus on this idea that the solution to the war in Ukraine is Ukrainian membership of NATO, right? Putin argues that the war in Ukraine is all about NATO expansion. Total bullshit. It's never about NATO expansion. NATO was never a threat to Russia. Every wave of NATO enlargement saw less defense spending by Europe, right? I mean, just imagine this. Putin argues that NATO is expanding and is going to attack Russia. Trump argues that in that period, European NATO has not been spending enough on defense, less than 2% of GDP. So how can a bloc that is not spending enough on defense to defend itself, less than 2% of GDP on defense, be a threat to Russia? It doesn't kind of add up. But actually, I think what's now clear is that Ukraine doesn't need NATO membership, right? If we imagine a scenario where Russia is the existential threat to Europe, the Americans are no longer there, the Americans will not come in to defend Europe if it's attacked by Russia. They're not doing it already with the thing in Ukraine. We have to stand up for ourselves. What are the keys to European security without the Americans? I'd say it's a combination of Ukraine. They are the most capable, largest military in Europe, the most effective military in Europe. They've held the line for 4 years against a much more powerful military force, the Russians. We should be learning everything the Ukrainians are learning in their warfare, and we're not. But anyway, that's a different issue. And secondly, it's Turkey, or Turkey. I mean, the two most capable militaries in Europe are those two. Turkey has 400,000 regular troops, 300,000 irregulars or volunteers, etc. Has a large conventional military. And a great capability in terms of drones. Its military-industrial complex. Turkey can mass manufacture tanks, armored personnel carriers, shells. We can't in Europe, right? Turkey offers lots of solutions. So it's the two, Ukraine and Turkey. I'd add the Finns. I mean, the accession of Finland to NATO was a huge win for NATO. 1 million troops, huge fighting capability, willingness to take on the Russians. So it's Finland, it's Ukraine, probably Poland add into the mix. Poland spends about 5.5% of GDP on defense, buying lots of new kit from South Korea. I mean, that's the core to our defense. But it's about forgetting about the Americans, telling the Americans, and actually I think being honest to Trump. I mean, this Rutte story about daddy, it's embarrassing, right? I mean, I think what we've learned from Trump, and you can think about Taco, is Trump's a bully, you confront him, and he backs off. The best thing for Europe is to actually out Trump. Tell Trump that you are killing NATO. This is the strongest alliance in history. It was a great strength. We brought lots to the table for the Americans. And because of your actions, you are killing this entity, and the US is weaker. And we're going to go off and do our own thing. And probably we can defend ourselves already in Europe against the Russians with this Finland, Poland, Ukraine, Turkey kind of angle. With, I guess, the military institutional memory of the Brits and the French, and with still our defence industrial capacity in France, UK, Italy, combined with the Turks, etc. So I think that's kind of one more angle. So it's, I guess, conclusions of the war. Iran war looks like an extended period of disruption to the global economy. Trump will go elsewhere because that's what Trump does. NATO's dead. We need to think about autonomous defence capability. Europe needs to work together. Middle powers, I mean, that's another angle. I was at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum last week. Turkey has leverage, right? You have assets people want. The Saudis, this new Saudi, Pakistan, Egypt kind of strategic relationship. We will see more of that. This new transport corridor, Saudi Arabia, up through Jordan, Syria to Turkey. Again, I mean, it's logical. We should see more of that. But I think we need to see more Turkey-European cooperation. The Europeans are idiots, frankly, and I think we have a long history in terms of Turkey-European relations, right? EU accession, Sarkozy, Merkel, privileged partnership. I mean, the fault's on both sides, right? But the reality is our interests absolutely now align, right? Europe, the number one security threat to Europe is absolutely Russia. Turkey has no interest in a Russian victory in Ukraine. A Russian victory in Ukraine means Russian domination of the Black Sea. It means Russia, if Russia wins in Ukraine, it means, Russia militarily has vastly developed during this war. It's much more capable now than it was at the start of the war. It will roll back Turkish influence in the South Caucasus and Central Asia. It's pulled back because of Putin's obsession in Ukraine. But Putin will go back into those places and it will push Turkey back. So Europe and Turkey have a common interest in countering the threat from Russia. I just worry that European prejudices, racism against Turkey are the biggest problem. And von der Leyen's comments this week were incredibly damaging. This message that we need to, in Europe, push back against negative influences from China, Russia, and Turkey. I mean, how is that possible? I mean, Turkey, a candidate member country, the largest military force in European NATO, and I would argue the key to European defence going forward. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? Now, there are some positives. We have some countries in Europe kind of get it, right? I mean, the Italian-Turkey relationship in terms of defence technology is great. I mean, we had the Baykar, Piaggio deal, Baykar, Leonardo. The Italians kind of get it. They're cutting through the bullshit, bureaucracy, and doing deals, right? Meloni, for whatever a Trump-worshipping kind of scenario, seems to be pragmatic and realistic. The Brits, I mean, we had yesterday the UK-Turkey strategic partnership, something I've been pushing for a long time. The Brits understanding. UK sees Turkey as a major strategic ally with two countries. We're, I guess, in similar positions with the European Union. We kind of mistakenly left, and now we're trying to figure out the new relationship with Europe. And I guess Turkey, has still ambitions to be a European Union member, although it seems kind of likely. And we're both in a position where we're trying to, I think both Turkey and UK want a similar relationship going forward. a strong defence, strategic partnership, strong economic ties, customs union arrangement, whatever the UK gets in terms of post-Brexit, I think Turkey wants and should get, right? So the problem with the UK is, our fiscal constraints and our institutional weakness at the moment in terms of politics makes it quite difficult to do things. But anyway, that's a different story. So look, I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. Maybe I end on one thing. I mean, people do ask me. The other angle, I guess, and conclusions from it is Taiwan, China, the war in Iran. Does this make this more likely or less likely that China will take Taiwan? A couple of thoughts there. I mean, I did think after the war in Ukraine that a big conclusion was from that war was that, and obviously looking back to Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, if you're a global superpower, don't get involved in a war you can't win. And that was the mistake the Russians made. And if I was the Chinese looking at that, I would only invade Taiwan if I knew I could win. And the other conclusion from that war in Ukraine was NATO spec military technology is far superior to Russian military technology. I mean, just think about it. The Ukrainians have stopped the Russians with third generation NATO kit, more or less. And they've beaten fourth generation Russian kit, right? So I think the superiority there. So again, the Chinese, they'd have to question whether technologically they would be able to beat the Americans. But then you look at the war in Iran, and in a way, and actually the other angle is, I guess, coming from what we saw in Venezuela with Maduro, and I think one reason Trump did what he did, and also the 12-day war against Iran, was this perception of this, again, huge US superiority technologically, right? Which perhaps made Trump overconfident in this particular war that he could win quickly. I would say maybe that's changed a little bit because, Iran stopped that military machine, survived. And actually, again, looking at Iran's military capability in certain areas, they've outperformed, and particularly in terms of drones. And I guess looking to China, I'm absolutely certain while the Americans don't seem to have learned anything about drone warfare and drone defense in Ukraine, I think the Chinese absolutely have, right? Naval drones. I mean, the Americans' unwillingness to put their navy in the Gulf to control the straits suggests to me that the Americans are terrified of Iranian naval drone capability, and the Chinese have it, right? So maybe in terms of the calculations on Taiwan, I think, again, Chinese thinking, can we win this war? Do we want to get in a war that we can't win? What are the ramifications of that? Do we have military superiority? I think overall, probably the conclusion is that they don't do it. They're less likely to do it. Wait. And obviously there's been some political changes in Taiwan recently that probably mean, with the Chinese opposition, seem very favorably inclined towards Beijing. So probably the Chinese, I think, wait in that respect. So I don't know. I've spoken a lot at the moment. Actually, one final thing, Turkey. And I've mentioned Turkey's strength in terms of some of the, demise of NATO. It presents some opportunities. In terms of the Iran war specifically for Turkey, just to kind of emphasize, it provides short-term risks, absolutely, but some long-term opportunities and potential benefits. The short-term risks are obvious, right? I mean, you've had 3 years almost now, a very difficult macro adjustment program from Mehmet Şimşek and the team, right? Now, we can argue about its success. I think probably we'd say overall it's mixed. It's achieved some great things, actually. I mean, inflation has gone from 80% to 30%. It's still 30%, and I know most Turks will think it's higher. But it's been achieved at the same time as gross foreign exchange reserves have increased to record highs, 200 billion, right? The central bank, and also the KKM, the FX Protected Deposit Scheme, has gone from 140 billion to nothing. To be able to increase reserves while getting rid of the KKM was extraordinary, right? And that gross reserve buffer was used to hold the exchange rate relatively stable in this period of higher oil prices from the energy price shock. But the reality is, Each $10 increase in the oil price because of Trump's war in Iran costs Turkey between 3 and 5 billion on the current account, and probably 1% plus on inflation. So this is a major shock. Şimşek's program has provided a foreign exchange reserve buffer to buy some time. But if the war goes on a long time and oil stays at $100 a barrel for a year, that's a challenge. That's a major challenge for that program. Probably the central bank will have to increase interest rates because the current account deficit will be larger because of that. There's no other alternative, frankly. So that's one thing. So short-term macro challenges. Long-term, though, as I argued before, it presents opportunities, right? Middle corridor power, increased defense strategic, technological engagement with Gulf states, with Europe. That will bring foreign direct investment. We've already seen the Saudi, Egypt, Turkey program means that Saudi Arabia will more likely to provide foreign exchange swap facilities to Turkey to help the central bank defend the currency. Tourism, Turkey will probably ultimately be a winner. People used to go to Dubai, probably come to Turkey. We saw, I guess in the last few days, Erdogan talk about tax advantages for bankers and other people to relocate from Dubai to Turkey. I mean, maybe that will happen, maybe it won't. But I think Turkey will win by people moving assets, capital, individuals away from the Gulf states, which, will be less secure because of the war in Iran, and Turkey will present a relatively secure kind of environment. So Turkey's kind of swings and roundabouts, short-term risks, challenges from the war in Iran, but ultimately maybe a long-term winner, I'd say. So probably end there. I don't know if there are some questions. Probably done for time, right?
Well, thank you, Mr. Timothy. My question would be on the Strait of Hormuz. It is still effectively closed both by the United States and Iran, and the situation is already impacting, all countries around the world. What if it stays closed for a longer period of time, and what happens if oil prices hit, for example, let's say, I think this is not an impossible scenario anymore. If it hits $200 per barrel, how our lives are going to be impacted by that? And do you think the countries are feeling the pressure right now, or there is a bigger crisis that is ahead of us that we are not feeling yet by the ordinary citizens or the governments?
Yeah.
So what risks do you see on that?
Look, I think it's unlikely. I have a negative geopolitical outlook for the region, right? I don't think it's that easy to resolve this issue, right? I think the Trump administration got itself into a war that it didn't really understand. It was fed information, perhaps by Israel or whoever, that they could deliver a quick victory and regime change, whatever. But we are where we are. I think it's possible the US could withdraw, right, and leave everyone to clean the mess up, and it's not that easy to clean up, right? And Iran, what does Iran want? It wants security. It wants this assurance that Israel and the US will not continue to go in every 6 months. And it wants economic assistance and sanctions moderation, right? All that was possible, obviously, with the Oman peace deal and basically the JCPOA, right? But whatever, we are where we are. But I think in a scenario where oil continues to push higher, the result probably will be global demand destruction, right? Before we get to $200 oil, right? Global growth will slow. There will be an adjustment. And, it will be adjustment of higher inflation and lower growth. It's a little bit like COVID. And the difficulty for central banks and policymakers and investors really is how that plays out, right? Central bankers are worried about the inflation hit from higher oil prices. And normally, and they're telling us that the experience from COVID was we got behind the curve in terms of responding to inflation. We were too slow to increase interest rates in response to COVID, and then we had that whole COVID inflation kind of spike. This time around, they're kind of holding. Before this hit, central banks were going to be cutting rates. Remember the Fed, we were all thinking about 75 basis point rate cuts this year or whatever, something like that. Now it's on hold, but I guess the question is the next move in interest rates higher or lower, in a way that do central banks need to hike rates to respond to the inflation hit, or ultimately, will higher oil prices see the global economy adjusting to lower growth, in which case they may need to cut rates in response to lower growth, right? So look, I mean, answer your question. It's clear, I think, that global growth is already adjusting weaker, right? You can see that in Europe, in the Gulf states, as I mentioned. I mean, it's hard to see their business models been sustained, really. Tourism, logistics. I mean, who's going to go to holiday to Dubai with this continued security risk from? I mean, the fortunate thing for the Gulf states is they have huge balance sheets, huge sovereign wealth funds that they can deploy to underpin the economies and buy time. But I think it's inevitable we see a period of lower growth and higher inflation, right? And I think it will impact also on the US. Now, maybe you could say the positive is that we will see a bit of a regime change in November because there are midterms, and maybe that will see, the House and possibly Senate flip, and there will be some constraint on Trump. So we see less damaging global interventions by Trump that have damaging effects on the global economy, right? But yeah, I mean, look, it is worrying. And as I said before, what I worry about, it's not just oil, it's everything else. Everything else that comes out of the Gulf that we don't know about, that suddenly, the fertilizers, food prices, helium, impact on chips. Like, we're so interconnected, and we kind of saw that through COVID. And the Gulf states are now so important to all our supply chains. I mean, but also capital markets, right? I mean, as I mentioned before, Gulf states have huge sovereign balance sheets that are invested globally. If Gulf states have balance of payments problems or fiscal shortages, they'll have to sell those assets. That will create instability elsewhere. Chinese investors invest in real estate in Dubai. If suddenly there's a real estate correction in Dubai, does that money leave? How destabilizing is that for global markets? So I think Trump in this disastrous intervention in Iran is creating huge systemic risks for the global economy. And I personally do not think global markets are adequately reflecting it. There are reasons, as I said right at the start, why markets are relatively sanguine, but it just doesn't feel right. It feels that markets should be in a different place to where they are at the moment. This guy had a question, I think.
Salman Farghali, journalism student at Marmara University. My question is, you once described Turkey as the last man standing in Europe. Do you still stand with that view today? And today, when we talked about competing with China, what do you see Turkey's advantages and weaknesses in this?
Look, I mean, what's interesting is, as you know, Turkey has a huge manufacturing base, right? I mean, there's been lots of outsourcing from Europe to Turkey. If you think of companies like Vestel, Arçelik, I mean, most TV sets that Europe sells are made in Turkey, right? It's ironic that I think the European, in terms of the European TV set association, is run by Turkish entities, right? Turkey's advantage in manufacturing, I mean, it has a strong manufacturing base. It has a good engineering culture. I mean, when you meet Mehmet Şimşek, he always tells you that Turkey has more PhDs per head than anywhere else in Europe. A very strong manufacturing culture, which, I mean, I've always been surprised by Turkey's resilience, right? In terms, I'm a macro guy. Turkey always faces these macro threats. I'm always worried about systemic crisis. Turkey always survives. And it always survives because it has great managers, because you guys live in a difficult environment and you're used to systemic shocks, right? And you kind of manage through it. And again, that Turkish, ability to ride through difficult situations, like at the moment with the competitiveness issue. Şimşek's whole program about real appreciation as a disinflation kind of anchor, I mean, it is causing huge stress for Turkish manufacturing. I get that. There is a massive competitive issue. But I guess its advantages is still its close proximity to Europe, its ability to have very quick turnarounds in terms of manufacturing, delivery times and all that over China. But the reality is, China is now, the threat from China for Europe and Turkey's manufacturing sectors are enormous, right? And looking at globalization, I mean, in the end, we kind of did make a mistake, right? I mean, if you go back to the 70s and 80s and the origins of globalization and the relationship with China, right? I mean, our problem in the West was, we had manufacturing where we had arguably over-regulation, strong trade unions, and the solution from Western capital was to ally with state capitalism in China. State capitalism enabled Western capitalists to offshore to China, where China offered manipulated exchange rate, right, an artificially undervalued exchange rate, which exploited Chinese labor, kept Chinese labor cheap. They intervened, extracted a profit from Chinese labor, built huge sovereign wealth reserves that were then used to, with One Belt, One Road, to buy dominance globally with soft power, right? Wage, employment rights, environmental rights were all put to the side, and the big Western multilaterals exploited that, right? And the irony for me is a lot of the large US billionaires who are supporting the Trump agenda were the same guys who made huge profits in offshoring in the first place to China, right? And now it's very hard to see Europe competing with this huge scale that China offers. Huge scale, again, regulatory, climate advantages, and just cheap finance because of the sovereign wealth fund money that allows them to fund very cheaply. How do you compete with that, right? It is unfair competition, without a doubt. And now we have dumping policies. So, it's difficult to square because, if you think about everything I've spoken about today, about NATO is dead, US and European interests no longer align, US interests and values no longer align, we need to look for alternatives. We need to look at autonomous defense capability, all those kind of things. I would also argue, in a way, we do need to reach out to China to show the Americans that we have an alternative, but at the same time, the Chinese are kind of eating our lunch at the same time. I think, but when I think of Turkey's advantages still, as I mentioned, it's this managerial culture, pro-business, entrepreneurial, dynamic, good demographics, but also combined with your advantages now in defense tech. What does Europe need? It needs a moonshot for its own defense, its own military defense. You guys, Turkey can offer that. Turkey can offer scale. If you think of Ukraine, going back to Ukraine, Ukraine has advantages in innovation around drones. It can't really provide scale. It's struggling to get that scale. Whoever wins in the war in Ukraine, who can combine innovation with scale. Turkey can provide Ukraine with the scale to scale up its drones to beat the Russians. Europe can't. Turkey can provide that, right? So again, I think Turkey's calling card for Europe is in this particular space that, it's found itself in, with a really strong defense tech manufacturing base. We don't want to rely on China for that. We need an alternative to China. And that perhaps is the niche. But it's a challenge because, China is so competitive, I'd say unfairly. How do you compete with that? You have to have a niche. And I think Turkey probably does have a niche.
Thank you for your speech, sir. I want to ask you about this concept of European NATO that you talked about. So NATO is dead,
yeah,
and Europeans basically have to form their own NATO without the United States, and maybe with Canada. I don't know about that. So can this hypothetical NATO survive, I think, coming right-wing populist wave in Europe? Like, can this NATO, European NATO, survive, AfD, the right-wingers in Bardella, and Nigel Farage? So these guys are quite Eurosceptic, and they don't really like Ukraine all that much. Yeah. Can they cooperate like how these current guys, liberals cooperate? Like, do you think this European NATO can survive this right-wing populist wave? And do you think this wave, how do you think their relationship would be with Turkey too? Like, for example, Meloni is a right-winger, and she actually sees it better than the liberals in Europe. And do you think Nigel Farage's Britain would continue this friendly relationship with Turkey, or would we see a change?
Yeah, look, it is a big question mark, right? What has changed positively for me? In recent years, I spent some time in Germany, right? A couple of iterations under Scholz and then Merz. I think, I'm not a huge fan of J.D. Vance, but J.D. Vance did a huge favour to Europe by coming to the Munich Security Council in February 2025. And he read the riot act to Europe. I mean, his comments were extreme. But actually, it was like the penny dropped, and Europe finally realised that this is a different America, right? And we can't wait for the next election, right? I mean, it's quite likely that something similar to Trump will win the next election, right? We just have to assume that this is the new America, and we have to figure out something else. But what changed after that J.D. Vance visit was, with Merz. I mean, it's remarkable, the change in the mentality now. You talk to German parliamentarians, they get it. They get the threat from Russia, they understand the Americans aren't there, and they're spending. The problem for Germany in particular is, the German population don't want to be in the army, right? People, same in Denmark or Sweden. It's educating populations to understand the real risk from Russia and the fact the Americans aren't there. And it's just scaling up quickly. And there are a lot of stuff the Americans provide that we are not able to yet, right? Intelligence, all those kind of things, right? But, and each country is kind of different, right? There are different stories in different countries. I mean, this week, or last couple of weeks, we've seen, Orban lose in Hungary, Radev win in Bulgaria, right? I mean, Radev is not quite the same character as Orban, right? I think Orban is a Trojan horse in Europe, and he's gone, and that's a big positive. I think Hungary's back into the European mainstream. Radev, I think in the end, his agenda is more anti-corruption. He seems, Bulgaria is very reliant on EU money, much more than Hungary. So I think in the end, Radev will behave. Romania, again, we saw with Dan's election, the presidential election, again, a pro-European victory. And I think it's quite interesting the change of narrative even in Europe from nationalist parties. You look at Le Pen in France, look at the AfD in Germany. They're not very supportive of Trump's intervention in Iran, right? So I think and suddenly, if you look at the opinion polls, opinion polls across Europe are not supportive of Trump. They're not supportive of US actions. And I think that is helping to change the narrative in Europe that we have to be more self-reliant, less reliant on the Americans. And hopefully it will have influence on the political cycle in Germany and France going forward. There does appear also to be in France that more moderate, more centrist politicians may be going to emerge to challenge Le Pen in next year's elections, right? And in the UK in particular, I think the positive thing for me in the UK is the opinion polls are overwhelmingly pro-Ukrainian, against Russia, right? And even a Farage government, which I think it's very unlikely we will see a Farage government actually. Elections are over 3 years away. We're probably going to see an electoral coalition in the UK, be a centre-left versus centre-right election when it happens. And if you look at the opinion polls, a majority of Brits are kind of centrist or centre-left, if anything. So I think it's unlikely in the UK. But yes, populism, in this scenario that we've presented of the Gulf War impacting global growth, weaker global growth, higher inflation, higher global uncertainty, higher defence spending. Just think, the more we spend on defence, the less we have for welfare and social spending, education, housing. It means less inclusive growth. It means populations will be less happy. They'll be more willing to blame foreigners. High defence spending is not really a solution, right? It's a solution to the immediate threat from Russia, but it means we have to make difficult choices, resource allocation choices, and these choices probably will help the populists, right? And the other angle is, look, where in the world, when you see increased defence spending, does it not end in wars? It typically does, right? So there are some reasons why I'm kind of hopeful, right? But at the same time, this is a much more uncertain world we're going into, made more difficult by the war in Iran, and it will help some populists, I would imagine.
Thank you. It was a very nice presentation. I really like the fact that you started explaining your biases, which is very transparent, and it's actually my first time to ever experience a speaker who was openly talking about his biases, and I really appreciated that. Most of my technical questions have already been answered in your lecture, so I wanted to ask you maybe something related with a layman understanding of world economy today. For example, just to look at an example, if a person is rich, let's say he has 15 houses, so if 2 of the houses got burned, he wouldn't really be in any danger because he has 13 more houses to go. And he could survive. It wouldn't be a matter of survival, of course, maybe opportunity cost. But when it comes to the world economy today, we have these huge economies, I mean, we're living in the 21st century. There's a lot of money going around. I would understand if, for example, the developing nations who have like very weak economy would find it very hard when a time of crisis comes. But the moment something happens in one corner of the world and the economy is affected, even the rich countries would be talking about economic crisis. I don't understand the philosophy. How is that very rich countries who have money more than they can ever use and they have a hegemonious amount of money in their banks, but still when, for example, when events like the Hormuz happens, when some event happens, then the whole world economy is in danger. I don't understand this delicacy. Why are we having this 21st century huge economies who cannot take any crisis, and a moment something happens, then everything goes into shambles? For a layman, how would he understand such a thing? Just like I told you, the rich person who has 15 houses, 2 houses burned, he would still be a rich person because he has 13 houses. But I don't understand when it comes to the world economy.
Yeah, no, I mean, very good, very good. I mean, the Pope actually said some great things this last couple of weeks. I don't know if you've been following him. He talks a lot of sense. Look, I mean, it's always interesting in my mind that, you know, we don't have any money until there's a war, and then suddenly people find money to kind of focus on the war, right? And as you said, there's so much poverty in the world, and you know we can't resolve in particular countries. I mean, it's small amounts of money, right? I mean, it's the way the world works. I guess the defense industrial complex, the primes, kind of run the show, right? And they have leverage. I mean, just maybe I'm not going to really answer your question, but I mean, one positive perhaps now, and is that changing global finance. I mean, and Gulf states have huge leverage, right? I mean, if you think, and in recent years they've used it for positive. You think of the Saudis, the Qataris, the UAE, and they have huge sovereign balance sheets, probably maybe $7 trillion combined. And we see it putting money to work in places like Egypt, in Pakistan, before the IMF. And the old times when countries in emerging markets got into problems, the IMF would turn up. Actually, the IMF left's relevant now. It's countries like Saudi and Qatar that are intervening, countries like Egypt that have difficulties and are positive agents for change, right? They are giving money and they are pushing for better policy outcomes in those countries. But at the same time, you know, they do have leverage over the US in terms of geopolitics. It's a shame that those countries don't use that leverage more in terms of politics in the Middle East, you know, shaping Israeli policy. I mean, you know, we've seen Israel in terms of its policy across the region having a very aggressive policy and being destabilizing for many countries across the region. America could call a halt to that, and maybe Gulf states could influence US policy by, you know, suggesting that they could maybe pull their sovereign wealth funds assets out of the US unless US policy changes. You know, I mean, the question you raised is a really difficult one, and you know, I've tried to focus on a few kind of easy answers, perhaps, to your question, but we could talk perhaps for hours on that.
So we did mention about, like how trades won't go back to how they were up until maybe 6 months at least. And this week, actually, we have covered the head of the UN Development Program, De Croo, saying that 30 million people, even if the war ended tomorrow, 30 million people will be pushed down under the poverty line. So, I want to, create my question around the humanitarian impacts of it. So he also said that, the efforts that we put in this developmental goals, SDGs and all that, they all got wasted in 8 weeks, just like that. So, where does this put us in terms of our understanding of role of international organizations in IP? Did the myth of, civil society, SDGs die? So are we only left with states who can actually, make an impact on economic realities, and then, all that IOs are just, there for until America makes a crazy decision? And yeah.
Look, the Trump administration doesn't like multilaterals. That's clear. Doesn't like the UN. He's created his own NGO, right? Peace, whatever it's called. Trump has a particular view of the world that, business makes the world go round, business is a solution to everything. I just don't think that's the case in reality, right? There are a lot of solutions. Markets very often don't work, right? And there are market failures, and governments and multilaterals need to step in. And multilaterals, UN is not very effective, but what else do we have, right? And, it is sad. But as you mentioned, the war in Iran, actually the war in Ukraine as well, it will make more people poor and impoverished globally. It's the sad fact about it. How do we address that, right? I guess there are plenty global south countries with resources and maybe solutions within. Again, this idea that Gulf states, huge resources, huge leverage, actually already positive agents for change. If you look at the development programs of Qatar, Saudi, they do many positive things. But maybe we need to do more, right? And maybe not wait for the Americans to take the lead. But, I'm a firm believer in multilateralism. Again, I think the global systemic crisis that we've had in recent years, COVID, global financial crisis, G20 came out of the global financial crisis. It's a positive institution. In an increasingly complex world, geopolitics, lots of moving parts, difficult to understand. I would think we need to work together better to find those solutions. But, you have one major player, and actually you have other big players, the Russians, who are looking to destroy the global order for their advantage. So everyone else, if you believe in something different, then I guess you need to work together to strengthen some of those institutions or make some new institutions to resolve some of those problems.